The tension was already thick in the CNN green room. Two names were written on the door, Caroline Levit and Jen Psaki. They weren't scheduled for a polite policy discussion. No, this was marketed as a generational face-off, a clash between experience and energy, legacy, and momentum. Caroline sat in silence reviewing her notes. She didn't need to rehearse. The facts were memorized. Her message was clear. The only unknown variable, Jen Psaki's tactics. Psaki entered 5 minutes before airtime, her signature calm smile in place, the kind that had deflected countless press questions during her White House tenure. But tonight, she wasn't standing behind a podium. She was sitting across from someone who had no intention of backing down. "You know," Psaki said casually, sipping from a paper cup, "I admire your ambition. I was ambitious once too. But trust me, this isn't as easy as you think. You've still got a lot to learn." Caroline looked up unfazed. "Good thing I learned fast." Psaki smirked, but her eyes narrowed. The moderator knocked lightly on the door. 5 minutes, ladies." As they were escorted to the stage, the audience buzzed. Journalists, students, strategists, and more than a few political influencers ready to clip every second for social media. The camera operators were locked in. Producers whispered behind the glass. This wasn't just news. It was combat. The lights went hot. The floor manager held up a hand. 3 fingers, 2, 1. "Welcome to the exchange," the moderator began. "Tonight, a conversation between former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki and current conservative voice Caroline Levit. Let's begin." But Psaki didn't wait. She leaned in, voice firm. "Caroline, you've got spunk. I'll give you that. But spunk doesn't equal qualification. And frankly, you're not qualified to speak on behalf of this generation or this country." The studio gasped. A few phones lit up. Caroline didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on Psaki's with the steadiness of someone who had been underestimated before. And this time, she had come ready. For a brief moment, you could hear the hum of the overhead. Lights. Caroline didn't rush her response. She didn't look at the moderator for help or scan the audience for approval. She simply folded her hands on the table, leaned in slightly, and spoke with unnerving composure. "You know, Jen," she began, "I wasn't surprised you'd go there. When women, like me, rise faster than expected, establishment figures like you have one playbook. Belittle, dismiss, and hide behind experience, like it's a shield from accountability." A ripple spread through the audience. Psaki blinked, caught off guard by the calm sharpness in Caroline's voice. "I may be young," Caroline continued, "but I've spent the last 6 years fighting for Americans in campaigns, in press rooms, and on the ground. I've been in border towns while you were in press briefings. I've seen the real-world impact of policies you only ever defended from behind a podium." The moderator raised a brow, but wisely stayed quiet. Caroline's voice didn't rise. Instead, it sank deeper, more focused, more grounded. "You say I'm not qualified?" She turned directly to Psaki. "Now, I don't need your permission to speak for this generation. I've lived the broken promises you helped write. My generation can't buy homes, can't afford energy, and can't even trust their institutions. You think being qualified means playing nice in DC cocktail circuits? I think it means being unafraid to tell the truth." Applause broke out, not raucous, but sharp, purposeful. Jen shifted in her seat. "Caroline wasn't done. You left your post with polished press clips and TV deals. I left mine with scars from the fight. You may have years on me, but I've got something more dangerous. Conviction." That last word landed like a punch. Viewers at home clipped the segment within seconds. On X, the hashtag #NumberQualifiedEnough was born. Young women reposted the clip, with the caption, "She just said what we've all been waiting to hear." Back on set, Psaki tried to regain footing. "Well," she said, lips tight, "if you think anger equals insight, that says a lot." Caroline tilted her head, smiling faintly. No, Jen. What says a lot is who's still listening after you stop talking. Jen Psaki straightened her back, her face tightening into the controlled calm that once defined her time at the White House. She'd faced hostile reporters. She'd been the spin doctor for the most polished administration in years. She knew how to recover. Or so she thought. Let's take a step back, Psaki said with a small, practiced smile. I'm not here to attack you, Caroline. I just think the stakes are too high to pretend credentials don't matter. You're a passionate communicator, but passion alone doesn't solve complex problems. Policy is hard, and governing isn't a performance. She leaned into the table, carefully threading her next sentence. America needs more than sound bites. It needs substance. And frankly, when you simplify everything into outrage, you lose the nuance, and the country suffers. The studio grew quiet again. It was a well-rehearsed move. Calm down the temperature. Sound like the adult in the room. Take back the intellectual high ground. But Caroline wasn't playing by DC rules. She waited, a beat, then another. And when she finally responded, her tone was so measured, so scalpel-sharp, it almost sounded gentle until you listened to the words. You talk about nuance, Jen, but where was that nuance when Americans were being told inflation was transitory? While gas prices doubled? Psaki's expression froze. Caroline leaned slightly forward. Where was that complexity when you stood at that podium and told parents that school lockdowns were science-based while kids lost years of development and mental health spiraled? The audience murmured. Psaki tried to speak, but Caroline held the tempo. And where was the substance when you promised unity, then dismissed half the country as backward or dangerous for daring to disagree? Now the moderator sat back. Even he knew this was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. Caroline turned to the audience, not to Psaki. We've had decades of polished messaging and expert panelists. What has it given us? A broken border, a weaponized DOJ, cities where you can't walk at night, and people like Jen calling that complicated instead of what it really is. Failed leadership hiding behind elegant excuses. The crowd burst. Not just applause now, but energy. Cheers. Real momentum. Jen Psaki opened her mouth, but it was clear she wasn't losing a debate. She was losing the room. The moderator, sensing the shift in the room, finally found his voice. Let's refocus for a moment, he said, glancing between the two women. Caroline, you've criticized this administration's policies, but what would you have done differently? And how does your background qualify you to lead those decisions? It was the kind of question meant to expose a lack of depth, the classic trap for someone young, someone new. But Caroline didn't blink. She took a quiet breath, then did something unexpected. She told the truth. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire. My dad worked 2 jobs, one in HVAC, the other snowplowing in the winter. My mom was a school aide who clipped coupons at the kitchen table so we could afford groceries and gas in the same week. She looked directly into the camera. Now we weren't poor enough for government help, but not rich enough to relax. We lived in that in-between space where working hard didn't guarantee peace, just survival. Psaki shifted slightly in her chair. Caroline continued. I watched my father leave before sunrise and come home after dark, hands cracked from the cold. I saw my mother cry silently when health insurance costs jumped again. And I remember what it felt like as a teenager to hear politicians on TV call us privileged or out of touch because we didn't check their political boxes. The audience fell absolutely silent. Caroline's voice didn't tremble, but her eyes shimmered. So when I speak up today, it's not because I read a policy brief or interned for a think tank. It's because I live the gap between the promises and the pain. I represent the people who get mocked for owning trucks, for praying in public, for believing boys shouldn't be in girls' locker rooms. She turned toward Psaki now. And I don't need a Harvard degree or a CNN contract to know what Americans are going through. I just needed to remember where I came from and why I'll never forget. A single clap rang out. then another. Then the room erupted. Not the partisan noise of a political rally, but the applause of human recognition. Jen Psaki looked toward the moderator as if to say, "Do something." But there was nothing to do. Because in that moment, Caroline wasn't just debating, she was testifying. Jen Psaki shifted in her chair, reaching for the glass of water in front of her. Her carefully constructed poise had cracked. For a split second, the studio audience saw something rare. Hesitation, but she recovered. Caroline Psaki began with a forced smile. "Your personal story is compelling, I'll admit that. But policy requires more than emotion. It requires understanding complexity, geopolitics, macroeconomics, healthcare systems, and with all due respect, a snowplow and a school aids experience don't make you a policymaker." It was a calculated insult dressed as a compliment, and Caroline saw it. She didn't even blink. "Interesting," she said, voice cool, "because I recall a certain press secretary saying inflation was a good sign of economic health and excusing skyrocketing grocery prices as people buying more meat. That was you, right?" The audience chuckled uneasily. Psaki's smile strained. Caroline didn't let up. "You talk about complexity, but let's talk results. When President Biden's policies caused energy prices to spike, families in my hometown had to choose between heating oil and medication. That's not a geopolitical, question my qualifications to speak on policy when you were paid to defend failure." The room erupted this time not with noise, but with something heavier reckoning. Phones lit up. Clips were already being posted. Caroline versus Psaki surged on X. Even political moderates online couldn't deny it. Caroline had landed a blow that couldn't be explained away. Psaki leaned back. Her eyes weren't angry now. They were worried because this wasn't a viral moment. This was a narrative collapse. By the time the next commercial break rolled, the moderator's earpiece was buzzing nonstop. Producers scrambled behind the glass wall. Network execs were texting in all caps. Even rival media outlets had begun clipping Caroline's last line, "Don't question my qualifications when you were paid to defend failure." And across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens because this wasn't just theater anymore. It was truth televised. Jen sat stiffly, adjusting her posture, but her words no longer carried the weight they once did. She knew how to manage narratives. But this wasn't a White House press briefing with pre-selected reporters. This was live. And Caroline had taken command of the stage without needing permission. Even the studio audience, once cautiously respectful, of both sides, had turned. Subtle nods, quiet murmurs, glances exchanged. The shift wasn't just ideological. It was emotional. Caroline's voice cut through again as the show resumed. "You know what I think scares people like Jen?" she said calmly. "It's not that I'm young. It's that I'm not afraid of being underestimated." Psaki tried to interrupt. "That's not." But Caroline pressed on. "You think you're defending the country by maintaining decorum? I think the country's crumbling beneath that decorum, and people are tired of excuses dressed as expertise." Boom. The audience reacted audibly, not with applause this time, but with a deep collective yes that came from the gut. Caroline turned toward the cameras. "Now, people watching this at home, you've been told you're not smart enough to ask questions, that you're too rural, too religious, too Republican to have a voice in your own democracy. I'm here to tell you that's a lie. Pause. I don't represent a party. I represent the people who are done being quiet." The moderator sat speechless. Jen Psaki crossed her arms, trying to regain composure. "You can speak in slogans all night, Caroline, but this isn't a campaign ad. It's a debate." Caroline looked at her, eyes calm. "No, Jen, it's a wake-up call." Online hashtags exploded. "Yin wake up. Call or Caroline claps back." Psaki stunned. Fox News went live with a breaking banner. Caroline Levit dominates debate stage. Psaki on defense. Even MSNBC ran a split screen. Caroline mid-sentence. Psaki caught silent, a rare freeze frame for the woman once known for circling back. Inside the CNN control room, one senior producer muttered under his breath, "She just flipped the narrative in under 20 minutes." And in the lobby, a former Obama advisor watching on a screen whispered, "We underestimated the wrong one." Behind the stage, CNN's media team was in overdrive. Producers tried desperately to rebalance the segment's tone. Editors whispered into the moderator's earpiece, urging him to move toward climate or pivot to foreign policy, anything to diffuse the storm that Caroline had ignited. Meanwhile, liberal media figures took to social platforms attempting damage control. Caroline Levit is charismatic, but this is pure populism. Being loud isn't the same as being right. Don't confuse a viral moment with leadership. But none of it stuck because it wasn't just volume. It was clarity. And Caroline had delivered it with surgical precision. She had spoken without chords, cited real reports, told her story without spin, and called out hypocrisy, not with fury, but with facts. In the green rooms of other networks, even rival anchors watched the live stream, jaws tight. One senior producer at MSNBC reportedly muttered, "She just turned Psaki into a press release." Inside the studio, Psaki tried to salvage ground. She sat forward, arms crossed, tone soft, but cutting. "You keep bringing up your personal background as if it gives you an edge in every debate. But we're here to talk policy, not personal hardship." Caroline didn't flinch. She waited, let the silence stretch, then answered calmly, "I bring it up, Jen, because the people making policy often forget who lives under it." The audience reacted. A low, deep wave of hums and nods. "You say it's not about personal stories. That's exactly the problem. You think governing is abstract? I think it's personal. For millions of Americans, policy isn't a headline. It's the difference between affording groceries or skipping dinner." Psaki exhaled sharply. "I'm not dismissing real pain." Caroline leaned in. "But you explain it away. That's worse." And that was the moment Jen knew. She couldn't out-narrate her opponent. Not tonight. Caroline wasn't just winning arguments. She was shifting belief. Meanwhile, outside the studio, protesters had started to gather, not to demonstrate, but to watch. Phones raised, chants echoing. "She speaks for us. We're not invisible." An independent journalist tweeted, "Psaki is still speaking, DC Caroline. Speaking America." Inside the control room, a CNN executive tapped his desk repeatedly. This was supposed to be a ratings grab. Now it's a referendum. And it wasn't over because Caroline had one more ace to play. And the next topic was foreign policy. She didn't just plan to survive it, she planned to bury the myth of democratic dominance with it. The moderator took a deep breath, trying to bring the conversation to a more measured topic. The fire of domestic policy had left Psaki on the defensive, and producers were desperate for a subject that might allow her to regain her footing. "So," he said, glancing at his notes, "let's turn to foreign policy. Ms. Levit, some have said your views are too simplistic when it comes to America's role in the world. They argue that isolationist rhetoric and strongman admiration don't protect democracy. What's your response?" Caroline leaned back, composed. She didn't rush her words. Her voice was lower, measured, but still sharp. "I think what Americans are tired of," she said, "is sending their sons and daughters to wars we can't define, for outcomes we can't measure, under leaders who never tell them the truth." She paused, letting the silence breathe. "Let's talk about Afghanistan," she continued. "Joe Biden's administration, under which Jen served, botched the withdrawal so catastrophically that 13 American service members died. Babies were handed over barbed wire fences. Allies were left behind. Billions in military gear just handed to the Taliban." Psaki stiffened. Caroline pressed forward. "You defended that, Jen. You stood in the White House briefing room and said it was a success because we evacuated over 100,000 people. You didn't mention the Americans trapped. You didn't mention the Gold Star families. Psaki raised a hand. That's unfair. Caroline's eyes locked on her. What's unfair is pretending your administration's failures are too complex for accountability. What's unfair is branding people like me as unqualified because we asked the questions you never wanted to answer. The room tightened. The audience was no longer clapping. They were listening deeply. Caroline continued, her tone steady. You talk about nuance in Ukraine. Fine. Let's ask the hard questions. How much aid is enough? How much oversight is in place? Why are American taxpayers footing the bill for European defense while our own border is wide open? Psaki opened her mouth, but Caroline turned to the moderator. I support strength, not confusion. I support peace through deterrence, not chaos through indecision. And I support putting the American people first, not last. The moderator was silent. So was Jen. Backstage, Psaki's team was furiously texting. One aide to a CNN anchor tweeted, then quickly deleted, "This is spiraling. Psaki's being outflanked in every direction." On Reddit, clips of Caroline's foreign policy lines exploded with titles like, "She's 27 and talking circles around Psaki." Even international outlets picked it up. A UK commentator posted, "The most composed voice on the American stage tonight isn't the veteran, it's the newcomer." Inside the studio, Caroline took one final breath. You wanted to talk about foreign policy? She asked. Here's my position. Protect America first always. Not because we should fear the world, but because we've earned the right to lead it without apology. And with that, she leaned back, expression unreadable. Across the stage, Psaki sat in stunned silence. Her years of experience, media polish, and polished debate lines couldn't shield her anymore, because Caroline hadn't just won the crowd. She'd taken the mantle of something bigger than the debate. She had become the voice of Americans who felt voiceless. And Jen Psaki, seasoned, respected, admired, had no words left. By now, the debate no longer felt like a panel. It had evolved into a cultural turning point, a televised flashpoint in the long war between polished political narratives and raw, public frustration. Caroline Levit wasn't just winning on points. She had redefined the terms of battle. Jen Psaki, once the face of progressive media poise, now sat unusually still. Her voice had vanished beneath the weight of a truth no amount of talking points could smother. The moderator cleared his throat, desperate to restore balance. Psaki, he asked, do you want to respond to Ms. Levit's statements regarding the Afghanistan withdrawal and Ukraine funding? Jen inhaled slowly. I served during an incredibly complex period. We made tough calls, and yes, mistakes were made, but no one was held accountable, Caroline interjected, her tone flat and final. That's the problem, Jen. You represent a generation of leadership that escapes every failure by saying it's complicated. But Americans don't get to hide behind excuses. They pay for every one of those complications, with jobs, with gas bills, with funerals. The room fell still. Then Caroline shifted gears and struck harder. You've been in politics long enough to know how to deflect, how to delay, how to dilute outrage into apathy, but what you didn't count on was someone who knew the playbook and wasn't afraid to burn it. Psaki opened her mouth, but Caroline leaned forward. You mocked me before we came on air, called me ambitious, said I had a lot to learn. You didn't say it to encourage me. You said it to contain me, to keep people like me in line. But you can't contain what's already moving. Her voice was quiet now, dangerously calm. You see a young woman with confidence and call it arrogance. You hear conviction and call it inexperience. You see millions of Americans who've had enough and call them misinformed. That's not leadership. Caroline turned to the audience. That's fear. Gasps. Psaki looked stunned, her signature smirk, the one she wielded so effectively behind the press room podium, was gone. What remained was a visible, slow realization. She was outmatched. Backstage, CNN's control room was in chaos. Producers scrambled. One anchor whispered off camera, "This is no longer a debate. It's a transfer of momentum live in front of us." On social media, the clips were relentless. Caroline just dismantled the entire Psaki doctrine. This isn't confidence. This is command. Even the New York Times' live blog admitted Psaki, once an unbeatable media tactician, now looks like she's clinging to scripts that stopped working 20 minutes ago. Then Caroline dropped the final match. "You said I wasn't qualified, Jen. But here's the truth. I didn't need a credential to stand up for the people who elected me. I didn't need approval to speak for those who were silenced. And I didn't need your permission to win this debate. Silence, not dead air. The kind of silence that says something historic just happened." Caroline folded her hands, calm again. And across the stage, Jen Psaki blinked twice and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. As the final camera panned out, the set of the exchange was bathed in quiet awe. Not because of silence, but because no one, not the moderator, not Jen Psaki, not the producers, knew how to follow what had just unfolded. Caroline Levit had walked into the studio as the underdog. She walked out as a defining voice of her generation. The moderator, visibly rattled, cleared his throat. "Thank you, ladies, for a lively," and he paused, glancing at Psaki, then Caroline, unexpected exchange. Psaki gave a thin nod, her eyes no longer trying to dominate, but simply survive. The woman who once held court in the White House briefing room now looked like a faded headline. Her responses drowned beneath the flood of Caroline's clarity. But Caroline, she sat tall, hands calmly folded on the desk, chin high. Her closing words came not in a roar, but in something far more dangerous. Certainty. "I didn't come here tonight to argue with sound bites," she began. "I came to say what millions think but are too often told to stay quiet about." She turned to Psaki briefly. "I respect service, but service without results is theater, and the American people are tired of being the audience to your performance." Then she turned to the camera. "The future belongs to those who speak with truth, not polish, with clarity, not credentials. And if this debate proved anything tonight, it's that facts, conviction, and courage don't need a teleprompter." The crowd, silent until then, erupted. Not wild partisan noise, but thunderous affirmation. Caroline rose from her chair. She didn't smirk. She didn't wave. She simply nodded, then walked off the stage. Backstage, a CNN staffer whispered to a colleague, "We just watched a generational shift, and it wasn't in Jen's favor." Within minutes, social media detonated. Caroline didn't win. She redefined the whole damn thing. Number sign not qualified. After that, she's more qualified than the last 5 press secretaries combined. Jen Psaki just got steamrolled by someone. Half her age and twice her spine. By midnight, Fox News, Newsmax, and even independent podcasters had flooded their coverage with the same line, Caroline Levit's breakout moment. But it didn't end there. The next morning, Caroline trended at #1 in the U.S. Clips of her calmly citing Department of Education stats side by side with Psaki's speechless reaction circulated across every platform. Students posted her lines over their own campus. Debates. Veterans tweeted support. Suburban parents, small business owners, and even some disillusioned moderates shared the same phrase, "She gets it." Psaki, meanwhile, canceled her scheduled post-debate interview. Her team issued a short statement. "We stand by Jen's message, but tonight the narrative got away from us. It wasn't just a loss. It was a passing of the microphone." Caroline, now back in her dressing room, opened her phone. Dozens of missed calls, messages from political strategists, journalists, even former critics, all now asking, "What's next?" She smiled faintly, then tapped a reply. "I didn't come to play a part. I came to change the story. And she had. From the moment Jen Psaki said, "You're not qualified," to the final step off that stage, Caroline Levit didn't just push back, she owned the moment. And America, it was still talking about her the next morning. It started with one line, "You're not qualified." But Caroline turned that line into collapse, into transformation, into awakening. This wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning. Words clashed, yes, but so did arrogance and accountability. Jen had experience, elite backing, and media comfort on her side. Caroline had truth and conviction. And that night, conviction won. Truth won. Caroline Levit didn't just defend herself. She gave voice to millions who've been mocked, silenced, dismissed. And to those who tried to contain that voice, she delivered one final message. You underestimated us. We've woken up. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something bigger.